It was Netanyahu who called Hochstein, who asked for a ceasefire that means he's desperate.
The greater Israeli society is waking up to the reality that their officials have been lying to them this entire time.
They're unable to achieve anything on the ground because they are too coward and too fearful.
Some people are casting doubt on the new leadership of the resistance, saying, this ceasefire comes at the expense of the people of Gaza.
If the resistance agrees to a ceasefire, that is a mere tactical move within the assessment that this is the higher interest for the whole resistance axis.
Some are saying that the ceasefire means that the resistance will have to give up its arms.
No one can stop or disarm the resistance. The occupation forces, they're scared of even their own imagination when it comes to Lebanon.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode on TMJ Podcast. I'm your guest host Hassan Shami, and today we are speaking with Batool Subeiti, an activist and political analyst who will be discussing the recent developments on the ceasefire in Lebanon. Salam Batool.
Wa alaikum assalam wal ikram.
Thank you for joining me today. You've been actively covering Lebanon and Gaza and offering an in-depth analysis of what's again happening with the Israeli aggression and the response of the resistance. Now all the talk is about the ceasefire in Lebanon. What do you think this entails, and why do you think it's happening now?
Yes, it's a good question. This ceasefire is not Netanyahu agreeing to the UN resolution 1701 that was put on the table in 2006 to end the aggression then. This is really Netanyahu, or an expression of him, trying to really find an exit route from the crisis that Israel is finding itself in. Right now, Israel has a collapsed army that was on the ground in the south. You have the whole of the north of the entity that's completely paralyzed. This paralyzation is extending itself into areas central to the entity. So Haifa, for example, is becoming the new Kiryat Shmona. The resistance's also ability to target areas within Tel Aviv and the Gush Dan area. So we saw that in particular on the Sunday that passed. There were over 50 resistance operations then. You're talking about the collapse of the state's capabilities. So if the Israeli occupation entity was able to achieve anything, the last thing Netanyahu would do is agree to a ceasefire. So this is really a manifestation of his desperation. And all logic, in actual fact, points towards the need for Israel to have stopped this war within Lebanon, because there's not only just mounting losses and failures, but there's also that element of external pressure as well. So if we just look back to 2 months ago when America greenlit that aggression into Lebanon, what did Netanyahu do? He went to the UN and he lifted those two maps, the green and the black map. And he was talking about this idea of the quote unquote new Middle East. That, America directly went into the region during the War of Terror years to consolidate. They effectively handed that over to Israel. But they haven't managed to achieve that, and they've not managed to achieve any stabilization in controlling any village in the south. The only outcome of their heightened aggression in Lebanon has been disturbances and disintegration within Israel itself. So they have no interest to remain, no strategic objective to continue. So the way that I would look at resolution 1701, rather than reading it point for point and saying, Israel's going to have to follow this and the Islamic resistance of Lebanon is going to have to follow that, it's not binding. It's only an excuse for the ceasefire. But even then, Israel doesn't need excuses. In 2000, we saw how Israel unilaterally withdrew from Lebanon due to the losses it was incurring. In 2005, it withdrew from Gaza in the wake of the Second Intifada that it was illegally occupying since 1967. So 1701 is just an ink on the paper. It means nothing to the entity. So also you could expect Israel to potentially break it as well. The Israeli army, in fact, today, it was announcing that it has decided that it doesn't want to reduce its forces on the ground in South Lebanon, which basically means, in a way, that the pressure will still be relieved from Gaza, because I think it was 5 or 6 elite military battalions that they sent to the northern front. But this also tells us something important, and that is that the occupation forces, they're scared of even their own imagination when it comes to Lebanon. But for them to return back to the war is also not a reality, because if Netanyahu wanted to continue the war, it wouldn't have stopped. It was Netanyahu who called Hochstein, who asked for a ceasefire. That means he's desperate. And as I mentioned, that's due to the resistance. The Black Sunday is what I would call it. Those hefty resistance operations. But irrespective of the resolution that was put in 2006, that 1701, the resistance we've seen with time, it's only expanded. So is the resolution itself binding to the T? No. This idea of like pushing the Lebanese resistance back to the Litani River. I mean, even Israel saying that it wants to continue to deploy its forces on the ground in the south is almost like a kind of excuse for the resistance, for them to even keep their weapon put beyond the Litani. So in a way, Israel's just vindicating the resistance and further legitimizing it as it breaks the agreement.
Now, Israeli settlers are saying they do not feel safe returning back to the north, and the greater Israeli society is waking up to the reality that their officials have been lying to them this entire time when they claim that they're close to victory. How do you see the Israeli society reacting to the ceasefire, and do you foresee a civil war unfolding in Israel?
Yeah. I will emphasize one fact, and that is the fragmentation post-war for the Israeli occupation entity is even a greater victory for the resistance than them stopping the war itself. Meaning, what is to come is greater. Yes, the resistance strategy has been a war of attrition, but the point of the war of attrition is to create the components within the Israeli occupation entity to make it collapse from within. And that metric is on every single level. So you've mentioned civil war. So, for example, you have the strata. You've got the strata of the super ultra religious Orthodox Haredi Jews. Their job is to read the Torah, to basically sit down and enjoy the luxuries of Israeli society whilst their secular people are fighting on the front lines. So the secular Zionists see them as like not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that's defending the country, whilst the secular Zionists who are fighting on the front lines have zero morale. And the people, as you've mentioned, the Israeli society feel like they've been lied to, because for the longest time they've been sold these kinds of lies, like the great victory is coming home, which means the dismantlement of the resistance. And they're apprehensive to go to the north because it's clear on all accounts that the resistance is still standing strong. So on what basis do the settlers return back to the north? And there is no concept of security. That security penetration happened in October the 7th. That was what was so destructive about October the 7th, is because they realized that Israel, despite being super, senior and on a top-notch level, Mossad, when it comes to intel, they're still penetratable, and they weren't able to hatch the plot of October the 7th prior to it happening. Otherwise, they wouldn't have allowed it to happen, because to allow it to happen is to go against the very essence of what Israel is, and that is it has to provide security for its settlers. These settlers are coming from across the globe, expecting to live a life of luxury and not war, and they can't afford to be in a society where they're not sure if they're safe or not. So that disintegration from within is something that we will see unfold and will show itself even more post-war, because in actual fact, during the period of war, that's when like the events of the war cover that disintegration and the extent of the disturbances and the fragmentation. But it's something we're going to see in full light post-war, and it's going to eat itself from within. That's the conclusion.
Okay, now to shift this conversation back to the ceasefire and the resistance, some are saying that the ceasefire means that the resistance will have to give up its arms. Is this true? And how will the ceasefire affect the resistance from an operational standpoint?
Yeah. Again, so that question comes from this idea of reading Resolution 1701 and assuming that it's binding on both sides. But as I've mentioned, neither side is truly bound to it. It's just that excuse to pass the ceasefire. What I will emphasize, though, is that this ceasefire is in actual fact a victory for the resistance. It's a victory. Why? Because the Israeli occupation entity did not manage to secure their objective. Did they finish the resistance? No. Did they manage to bring in a new government and to displace the resistance from the Lebanese government? No. Regarding fighting Israel, no one can stop or disarm the resistance. Resolution 1701 was there since 2006. The greatest expansion to the Lebanese resistance between the Litani and the South happened from since 2006. It's 10 times stronger today than it was a decade ago, despite the resolution still being there. So it's actually, this ceasefire is not an expression of the Lebanese resistance stopping military fire and settling for the political route. It is Israel that is making concessions here. It's not the military wing of the Islamic resistance of Lebanon that's signing a ceasefire. it's effectively the Lebanese government that's doing that, which, yes, the resistance is a part of and doesn't want to go against. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the resistance in Lebanon is not obliged under anything per se. So no, the ceasefire does not mean a disarmament of the resistance as some think. And when they read Resolution 170, they assume so. The ceasefire has nothing to do with that. And I'll end this question by saying that if the objective of Lebanon to enter the war in support of Gaza on October the 8th, 2023, was to act as a pressure lever to bring the war to a halt, to act as a supporting front, then Lebanon's objective on the 23rd of September 2024, when America greenlit the Israeli aggression, was in fact elevated from the primary objective to one of preventing Netanyahu from securing the quote-unquote new Middle East project that he hoped to actualize after defeating the Islamic resistance of Lebanon. The idea that he had is that if Lebanon collapses, then the fronts in Gaza and Syria would collapse, and that he can bring down the government in Iraq, and then he'll go into Iran. The undercover collaborator networks will be unleashed, hundreds of thousands on the streets, and you'll basically get quote-unquote regime change there. And then he'll go into Iran. The undercover collaborator networks will be unleashed, hundreds of thousands on the streets, and you'll basically get quote-unquote regime change there. So that's where his drunken high took him. But obviously, none of that was achieved. And so the ceasefire is nothing more, therefore, than Israel putting its hands up, waving the white flag and saying we're unable to achieve this goal. And that's even more humiliating than the 2006 retreat, because this was, in actual fact, Israel's last shot. America was like, shoot your shot. Let's see what you're capable of. We're going to give you these few months between the transfer in the American administration. Let's see what you're capable of. If you fail to defeat the resistance on the ground, then that's going to signal your own collapse, because the resistance is not sleeping and it will continue to accumulate its capabilities. October the 7th happened when no one realized. So we don't know what's under the table.
So with this ceasefire being a victory for the resistance, how does this benefit the axis of resistance as a whole? And what is the larger goal here for all of them?
Yeah, it's a good question. The objective of the current phase of confrontation, and this is something we have to emphasize, is not to liberate 1948 Palestine, but to stop Israel from achieving its goals. And on that merit, if you look at the resistance, it has succeeded. The resistance has been fighting a defensive war since October the 8th, not an offensive one. The objective of the resistance for all of these months has been to bring the war in Gaza to a halt. So now that it's expanded into Lebanon, another core objective becomes to bring the war in Lebanon to a halt likewise. And we see that the Gazan resistance have achieved, their goals of capturing hostages in exchange for prisoners during October the 7th. But this conflict is much, much broader than just October the 7th and what we're seeing in terms of Israel, Lebanon, and Gaza. We need to look beyond the immediate front. The scope of the resistance is to get rid of imperialism in the whole region. So yes, a ceasefire has been announced, but the resistance is still expanding its fronts, its capabilities. It doesn't stop at a ceasefire. Sayyid Khamenei mentioned this, in fact, before yesterday. He said, we need to create the grounds for a kind of new phase of confrontation. He spoke about the need to expand the fronts and said that further mobilization and preparation is important in this regard. So, for example, Jordan is an area where Israel is placing its attention on. Last month, I believe the occupation forces announced that they'd be forming like a new division border. So a new division that borders across the West Bank and Jordan. So the fear over here is that there'll be some kind of smuggling of weapons from Iran through Jordan into the West Bank. And one of the MPs from the Jordanian parliament, his name is, I think, Ahmad Adwan, he was actually arrested not long ago for smuggling weapons into the West Bank. He used his diplomatic passport to do that. So the people in Jordan have this kind of appetite for a resistance. So overall, what is the resistance direction? It is one of accumulating on the ground. Not everything has to be seen by the eye. So the Lebanese resistance right now, this war has stopped on their front. They have the time to maintain, to restructure, to recuperate. And that phase of maintenance of the resistance, maintaining itself, is as important, if not more important, than actually striking on the battlefield. And I think it was yesterday that Netanyahu also mentioned something along the lines of, Bashar al-Assad is playing with fire, which I understood to potentially mean that the resistance in Lebanon might use Syria as a ground to launch. So, we have to think of it as one front. Israel is facing 7 fronts. It's fighting against 7 fronts. It's not just Lebanon. And each front has a role to play in coordination within the passage of time. So a ceasefire in Lebanon is actually a prelude to a ceasefire in Gaza. And all of the entities' objectives have failed. In Lebanon, they failed for an Israel 2.0 project. And in Gaza, they have failed to consolidate their presence on the ground. The resistance is still strong there. Their infrastructure is intact. The ammunition supplies seem to be running through the tunnels. They're still ambushing Israeli soldiers on a daily basis. The Gazan resistance are also the strongest side within Gaza as well. So that's the reality on the ground.
So I know many of us have heard the chatter of, since the ceasefire took place, the late Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah said that there will not be a ceasefire in Lebanon without a ceasefire in Gaza. And so now some people are casting doubt on the new leadership of the resistance, saying, this ceasefire comes at the expense of the people of Gaza. I know you touched up on it on the last answer, but how would you directly respond to this?
Yes. No, it's a good question because, as you'd mentioned, there are those who are sowing these seeds of sedition willingly or unwillingly, and actually feeding into the narrative because, believe it or not, but Netanyahu actually suggested that that was one of their achieving goals, that they managed to split the fronts. So essentially, he's putting this idea of victory forward. A tactical ceasefire in Lebanon was never to benefit Lebanon at the expense of Gaza. That would be the case if you saw them as separate fronts, but the resistance axis is one front. The resistance axis will never separate their fronts. Why? It's a foundational strategy. If the resistance agrees to a ceasefire, that is a mere tactical move within the assessment that this is the higher interest for the whole resistance axis. That is in full coordination. So, for example, today, we saw that the other fronts in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, and in Iran sent their congratulations to the Islamic resistance of Lebanon on the ceasefire, which tells us what? Lebanon cannot take such a decision if the other fronts don't agree. And if intervention is deemed necessary, this is an equation that governs the unity of the front. If intervention in one of the fronts is necessary, the next closest front to the axis will intervene, and no front is allowed to fall, period. This was demonstrated on October the 8th. So, if the Lebanese resistance, for example, during this period was under threat, you would see the front in Iran directly open. You'll see direct intervention from Iran in the same way that Lebanon acted to Gaza, Iran would act to Lebanon. So essentially, the resistance axis fill each other's gaps. And just wrapping our head around this kind of logic, if there was a ceasefire tomorrow in Gaza and we saw fire in the West Bank, if Gaza doesn't rush to the aid of the West Bank, that doesn't per se mean that Gaza is abandoning the West Bank. That's not how it works. We can't apply the same strategy throughout time when it's not static. The situation on the ground is dynamic and it's changing. So there can't be this consistent application to say, oh, Sayyid Nasrallah said something. But, during Sayyid Nasrallah's time, there wasn't that greenlit aggression. He was talking in the basis of the phase in which the Lebanese resistance was acting as a supporting front. So if anyone thinks that the leadership of the resistance party can take the shot and split the fronts, they're mistaken. We're not talking about the Islamic resistance of Lebanon here. It would be a different party. It would be a leader for a different party because the fronts on a strategic level cannot split. And we have to understand that we are in a different phase now than we would have been before.
So right now, some are saying that the ceasefire is giving Israel time to replenish its arms and its troops and come back with a strong offensive. Do you believe that Israel, with the ceasefire, is accepting defeat, or they'll attempt to come back and hit harder?
Definitely defeat. There's no question about that. Look, it's not a matter of replenishing their arms. They have the arms of the world. That's not the issue. They're unable to achieve anything on the ground because they are too coward and too fearful. If you're unable to fight in the ground, then you cannot win the war. Otherwise, what Israel reigns supreme in is 3 areas. One of them being intelligence, which means it's able, to strike also with precision and, key figures. The media, they own the powerful media. The third one is the tools of mass destruction and the ability to create fire belt. So they're not short in the supply of weaponry and arms. That is unconditional from America. America will never cease to give them that weaponry. It's a matter of just being too afraid to fight on the ground and effectively getting cooked by the resistance forces. It's almost like the ceasefire is a plea from Netanyahu. Otherwise, if Netanyahu was doing well, he would never withdraw. That's just the fact. He's not bound by any resolution for resolution 1701 to push him in that direction. The only reason that he called Hochstein and asked for this resolution to be implemented because they're having it really bad.
Batool, as always, I appreciate your in-depth analysis, especially on the region. And I want to thank you so much for joining us, especially on this timely issue, and wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me on this latest episode today. If you like what you see here at TMJ News, please like and share this video and make sure to subscribe to this channel for more content.